welcome to a talk about modern data management in Vue. I think over the years, my paradigm on how I manage data in my reactive front-end applications, Vue is my favorite. It's the one I work in the most, but I think these concepts can and do apply to any of the modern reactive front ends. So even if you're a React dev, an Angular dev, whatever, a lot of these, there will be analogous players in your ecosystem that will do this. Do I have any devs in here that are not like primarily Vue devs, or are we all like primarily Vue devs? Other than you, Martin, I know. Okay, so we're all Vue devs in here? Yeah? Okay, cool. So yeah, how many of you guys have heard of tan-stack query and know what it is? Okay, good, because I want you to not know what it is. Because so this talk has been influenced by two of my friends, Alex Rivery and Martin Rojas. Martin's here today. They run the Vue and React meetups locally, respectively, and every year we have these like great conversations about how we're architecting our applications. And several years ago, Martin introduced me to React Query, and it was this like cached querying library for the server interactions. At the time, I was using global state for everything to achieve loose coupling of my data with my component trees and whatnot. And it was interesting. He was like, I pretty much use that all the time. And so anyway, we'll dive into why that's cool here in a minute. But my name is Will Marple. I'm a principal engineer at Black Airplane. We specialize in full stack web and mobile application development. I'm a full stack web dev. Primarily use Laravel and relational databases for my backend work, but as I said, love Vue. I've worked in React, Angular, Vue projects, even done a little bit of Quick, and Vue still remains my favorite front-end framework. So the overview about what we're going to talk about today. I'm also a dad. So, shameless dad jokes will abound. But we're going to go over what our options are today for data fetching. What do the data flow patterns look like in our component trees in Vue? What are some of the state management challenges that we can run into day to day? We're going to go over tan-stack query, what it is and why today it's a great place to start. And then we're going to go over state machines and Pina, and when to use them and how they play together. So let's talk about the problem statement. I follow a guy named Theo online. I'm sure many of you know who he is. He loves a channel called UI.dev. I think it's a super cool channel. There's a lot of React stuff on there, but it's generalized around these concepts of reactive front-end frameworks. And they said this really well. I like the framing. Getting data into our apps is easy. It's easy to go fetch the data. It's managing it over time in the context of reactive front-end life cycles that can be hard, right? So like, how many of you guys remember the exhilaration that you felt as a young developer, like the first time you made async call to the back end and like you fetched some data? And yeah, that was cool, right? If you remember that, you probably also remember the pain and trauma that you have felt as you've run into bugs that can occur when you're doing that in the context of reactive front-end programming. So the paradigm for this talk is going to be, you are responsible for architecting a new application. It could be a new abstraction inside of a monolith, a brand new greenfield project, a new island in your front end, whatever it is. You're responsible for this. So the first thing you've got to think about is, how am I going to get the data? What mechanism am I going to use? Am I going to use any dependencies to get the data? I need to stash it somewhere because it's not a one and done thing. How am I going to architect my component trees? How many trees will I have? Will it be one big one? Will it have multiple siblings? Will I have to pass data around and distribute it laterally across those trees? And then as things change in the front end, where data may change and other data may need to react to it, certain things may happen, user interactions may happen in the front end. How do I manage my data over time? So let's build a mental model for, let's just get the data into the app, right? fetch on render versus render on fetch. First, we're gonna keep most of the time, we're gonna be in client-side world. So we're not gonna get too heavily into server-side rendering, Nuxt, that sort of thing. Our mental model here is we're on the client for most of this talk. Although Tan-Stack Query and a lot of these philosophies will apply to an app where you are using Nuxt. So fetch on render, the paradigm is just like I've fetched some data, so now I need to render, versus like render on, backwards. I'm rendering something, I'm in mount, create, whatever it is. Now I need to go fetch something. I'm on the server. I have fetched something from my data layer or what have you, and now I need to render something, right? So what are some options? Native Fetch API. I don't personally know of anybody that when they are going to build a production application, they go, you know what, I think it'd be a great idea if I just like rolled my own everything and just handled all of my like cache busting and, rich error response handling. And, I'm just going to sprinkle that around my app. If you do that and it's working well for you, I'd love to talk. But it's an option, right? Another concept that is kind of tangentially related to the first problem statement is the 5 o'clock rule. And I thought this was also a great framing, that the level of abstraction for solving a problem will continue to bubble up until it allows you and me to stop thinking about it. And a big part of this talk is identifying emerging patterns in the packages that we use every day. Alex literally told me about a package I didn't know about last night at the speaker dinner that highlights this exact point. So I'm talking about using Tan-Stack Query to use cache querying in combination with something we already have, Pina, right? There is a package being developed right now called Pina Colada that is, getting giggles, that literally is that. It's the marrying of those two things. So we're already seeing the 5 o'clock rule starting to evolve and happen as this conference is going on. 2-3 years from now, who knows? Maybe we see Pina Colada and Tan-Stack Query and Pina are now abstracted behind Pina Colada or whatever it is that comes out of that, right? So anyway, the next evolution in our thought process, remember, we're getting data into the app. We decided not to use the native fetch API. So the next natural evolution is we're going to use an HTTP client of some kind. I like Axios. I'm a Laravel developer. Axios has been included in the framework. I got a woo. Right. Anyway, it's been a battle-tested solution for me, right? And I still use it today. It's still something I reach for today. What's it giving you, right? Any automatic errors raised for anything over 400, automatic parsing of your JSON, request response interceptors. That sounds fancy, but I had a couple of them. I had a couple of them here. It's just a way of hooking into and doing like a middleware kind of thing before or after a request happens globally. And these can be super useful. So it doesn't introduce an additional dependency, but a battle-tested and small one at that. Okay, so what is Tan-Stack Query? We've started kind of talking about what this thing is. It's, at its core, as you start to develop your mental model around it, because it can get, it can do a lot of things. But as you start to introduce it to yourself, it's just a caching mechanism for your server interactions. So instead of just like making an Axios call to go fetch some data, and then when you need that thing again, or maybe like stashing it in local storage and writing your own deterministic logic around like, hey, maybe I should like invalidate this stuff that I have in local storage and like go get a fresh copy of it because of XYZ reason, right? It is an abstraction that's doing that stuff for you, and a lot more, which we will delve into. One of the cool things I want to point out, and I will keep pointing out as we're going through this, is it does have dev tools for debugging, because when I don't think React Query had that when it first came out. And that was my first thing, is that when I'm using Pina or Vuex at the time, like DevTools was a big deal for me. Like when I pull my state out and I put it in this bucket and organize it, I need to open some kind of tooling and be able to see like what's going on with my data at any given time, as the complexity of my app grows. So it's super cool that we do have a debugging available. Here's a basic example. So right out of the gate, one of the things I noticed is that you have consistent loading and error states happening with the package. Like, I don't know how many of you guys have worked in code bases where umpteen developers have worked in there. They've all had slightly different opinions on how to handle loading, how to handle errors, like where they organize things, like what they name variables, whatever it is. Like, it just this out of the gate was nice to me. Like, oh, loading and error is going to be like normal and normalized across all my components. But you can see it integrates really nicely into Composition API. And really easy to and approachable to understand how this is working, just like you would use any other composition function. So I did say we're starting out as, hey, this is a cached querying library, but it does a lot beyond that. People are using it for a lot beyond that. File operations, browser APIs, offline support, media devices, index DB operations, basically anything that's a promise. This thing can cache the result from it and offer you a lot of the built-in features that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. So let's talk about some of the problems that it can solve and some of the features that it has. Race conditions. This is something that can become a problem in any reactive front-end framework. In React, it's most often seen fetching in a use effect. In Vue, we've kind of shown this here as well in a watch, where depending on how fast the data changes and how long it takes for that promise to finish, you could be getting the wrong data coming back out of this result. Whereas with the TAN stack, you get automatic request cancellation, latest data guarantee, no stale updates, built-in request deduplication. Out of the box, free, don't have to think about it. 5 o'clock rule. Caching and stale data. Configurable stale time, background data revalidation, automatic cache cleanup, smart refetching strategies. This is very approachable. It does a lot of stuff for you for free, automated. Again, 5 o'clock rule, don't have to think about it. But the thing that I love about it, one of the patterns that I've recognized working with lots of different frameworks and libraries is that the ones that are truly like transcendent, the best ones, have this elegant way of kind of expecting and automating things, making it simple for people and approachable for people to start using it. But as the complexity needs grow, exposes an API that grows with you and allows you to highly configure what's going on with it. Loading and error states. We already talked a little bit about that, but there are a few other things that kind of go beyond the original conversation. Automatic retries. So if you are making an Axios call and Axios is returning the promise, TAN stack queries were handling the result of that promise for you. If Axios throws the 400, 500 error, what have you, you get automatic retries, no configuration needed. It's going to retry 3 times by default with an exponential backoff, which I think is super cool. And then you also get background updates, which means somebody switches away, comes back to the tab, loses network connection, reconnects. You can also configure a manual refetch if you want. This thing's going to automatically invalidate the cache and go out and get the data again. Dependent queries. So you may already be thinking, hey, okay, this is sounding pretty cool, but how do I handle like the situations where I have some data or I'm waiting for some data, and like when that data shows up, now I need to go out and get some other data because I needed the ID for something to go out and fetch this other thing, or whatever your case may be, right? So that's baked in. You can do it based on presence of data. You have a fully customizable conditional callback that you can supply when that conditional dependent query should happen. So and oh yes, the baked-in waterfall prevention. Now it's not foolproof. Like, you can still have waterfalls, because I'm sure a lot of us have run into scenarios where we start building out this application where maybe we're manually building all the deterministic logic of like when this event happens, I go fetch this other event. But then that kind of like snowballs into, okay, well, this is getting kind of heavy-handed, right? Like I can't just go make umpteen calls to the server every time I have this chain of events that blows up in my system. So there are mechanisms like parallel fetching, data hoisting, which means it's pulling the cache up in your component tree, making it more available throughout your component tree, optimized refetching that is going to go the distance to help you prevent those waterfalls. Optimistic updates. So how many of you guys ever had to or are implementing optimistic updates? Cool, so I'll go over what an optimistic update is then. So basically, we're using the old to-do example, right? But could apply to anything. We have a list of to-dos. The list is already present on the client side. User wants to update something, right? Instead of we hit the button, make the server call, then when it's successful, we merge that data back in, and then we show the update. We optimistically, we show the update, we mutate it immediately, but we also cache the previous version because we now need to handle happy path, unhappy path there, right? So it just gives a really snappy user experience where as soon as they hit submit, they immediately see the change. Server call goes out. On success, we probably design the UI so it's like there but grayed, then fully visible once the server call comes back. And then on error, we use that cached previous state to roll it back and maybe notify the user in some way, hey, this thing didn't work the way you thought it would. That feature I just described is built in to this package, and you get it out of the box. Infinite queries and pagination also baked in, which I thought was pretty big. Like the first couple of times I built an infinite query, it was fun. After that, like I'm happy for it to be a 5 o'clock rule abstraction, right? Like I'm happy that it's available in this package. You get cursor and offset based pagination, page prefetching, seamless data merging. How many times have you had to write your own logic that has to go like, okay, we got the update back from the server, now I got to go search through the collection, figure out how to merge it all back in, and all that kind of stuff. It's doing that for you in the cache. Refetch and polling. So we talked a little bit about manual refetch earlier, but you can simulate server polling. So if you wanted to have some sort of like, I'm watching something on the server and I'm polling the server every so often, it has that baked in as well. Oh, and you can also do it conditionally. So you may run into this situation where you're like, okay, I need to poll the server because I'm waiting on some, like, let's say you had a queued job on the server side and that may take an indeterminate amount of time. You don't know how full the queue is right now or how long it'll take to run, how much compute's available, whatever it is, right? And so you're just gonna poll until it's ready, and then it'll be ready, and then conditionally, once that thing has been satisfied, we can now stop polling. So it'll do that for you too. Memory management's not something that we as JavaScript developers have to think about a ton as compared to like Rust developers or like C++ developers that have to manage their memory all the time, right? It's a concern. We have to be aware of performance. But when we are doing things like infinite queries, we have to be concerned about how much stuff we're loading into the front end, into memory at any given time. And so this package has garbage collection built into it, has some automations built into it to help. You can configure the cache lifetime, but it's also got automations built in to help like cut out stale data, stuff that's not being used, clean things up as you move along. SSR support, so I just want to mention, like we are mostly client side for the duration of this talk, but if you are using Nuxt, or there are other packages out there in the Vue ecosystem like Vite plugin SSR that's framework agnostic that you can use for server-side type, meta framework type stuff. Tan-stack query works back there too. So if you have stuff on the server where it's promise-based and you do want to limit the number of calls that are being made, you can use its caching capabilities on the server side also. So we overshot the target a little bit because our goal was just to get data into the system. But we used Connect.Tech query, and now we're not only fetching the data and getting it into our system, but we have a place to stash it, and we have a lot of mechanisms on how to manage it over time. So this is kind of where we pull together the history of what happened, because you heard me talk a little bit about React query and Martin mentioning that to me years ago and that sort of thing. Connect.Tech query was written by Tanner Lindsley, is the guy's name, and it started out life as React query. It lived its life for a few years and matured. Then they realized, like, hey, this thing can be framework agnostic, right? And in 2022, it multi-framework support became available for it. And now it's matured into quite the dependency. So you get it for just regular JS, TS, React Vue, Angular, Svelte, Solid, the whole gamut, really. So anytime you're going to introduce a dependency like this, like, you are likely asking yourself the question, like, should I do this? Like, I have to qualify this package first before I just pull it into my project, right? But Connect.Tech query, as I did my research, like, it is widely used. Like, there's enterprise support, weekly updates, very active development, large community, growing community. But one of the interesting things that I found is that while there are 4.2 million weekly downloads in the React community, there's only 142,000 in our community in Vue. So that told me immediately, like, Vue community doesn't really know about this thing yet. React community obviously does. So that was kind of the impetus for this talk. So let's start pulling it together, because we're getting data in the system. We have to now consider, what's our component architecture going to look like? How's our data going to flow through those component trees? And then we're going to finish up with Pina. So the way I like to architect my apps is I like to keep the presentation layer, my Vue single file components, as clean and minimal as I possibly can. And composable functions are the way to do that. Like, as we talk about data now, I would typically have some sort of like lib with JS or TS files where those Axios calls are actually being made. And then I would have a composable with Connect.Tech query that is actually like we're just using Connect.Tech query to implement like a basic CRUD that we've all done a million times here, right? But this is just organizational. This is just an organizational point of like how I would kind of architect that. Then here, using it, pretty straightforward. We've all done this at this point if we're using Vue 3 composition API. I'm a big fan of the script setup. I don't know what y'all use every day, but when I was first learning composition API, I got bit so many times using the setup function with the explicit returns. Like, I would have all of my stuff set up, and I'm like, data not showing up, and then I'm like, hitting myself because I forgot to do the return. I love the magic of, like, it's automatically an async setup, and you don't have to do the explicit returns, right? And so this really brings you to the point where you get data flow freedom. This is the whole goal of this whole talk, is to get freedom, like, from worrying about, like, I have this growing number of props that are coming in through various components in my tree, and how am I getting data back up, and I'm emitting events to get back up the tree and that kind of thing. When we decouple the concerns of the data from the tree, we get something more like this, very clean. Really don't have to pass much in the way of props. So components will fetch their own data. They don't care about input data anymore. The Connect.Tech query package will give them a shared cache across all the components, which gives them they're automatically synchronized. And that really achieves the loose coupling that we were looking for. So let's finish up talking about state machines. Whatever happened to Pina? How many of you guys using Pina today? How many are you using Vuex? A couple of Vuex users. You hate those explicit mutation functions. The Pina, that's probably my favorite thing about Pina is that no more explicit mutation functions. But let's compare them. These two things can work together. TAN-STAT query, let's consider it as built for the server state, automatic caching, data synchronization, and loose coupling. State machines give you more explicit state control for complex workflows. Think about it for state close to the UI, state transitions. Pina's advantages, very similar to TAN-STAT query. Boy, tongue twister. You get a great DX, full TypeScript support, Vue DevTools integration, hot HMR, and intuitive API design that plugs in seamlessly with the composition API. Oh yeah, and I already talked about the mutation functions. Sounds like a lot of you are already using Pina though. So when to use Pina? So I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, okay, great, like I'm using TAN-STAT query to do a lot now. Like when would I think about using Pina? This is surely not exhaustive, but this is just to kind of get the juices flowing in your brain about like when might I use Pina? Multi-step form wizards, shopping cart workflows, authentication flows, form state management, global features like the auth object or a theme or user preferences, application settings, things like that. It's type safe, intuitive, and straightforward. So for anybody that's not used Pina before, this is how a Pina definition would look in your system using TypeScript. I like that it's not namespaced anymore. In Vuex, I found myself kind of like leaning into the namespacing situation, and that introduced like hierarchical, like nested modules, and that was a pain in the butt. I really like Pina. With Pina now, I just flatten them all out, and they all have their own unique key string that identifies them as a store. Pretty straightforward. If you've ever worked with a component state global state library, you probably know what's going on here. We're just returning some state, happen to be typing it, and we've got some actions that can be taken against that state. And this is just consumption. This is just a consumption example of like how would we use this in a single file component using composition API. And pretty straightforward. So we're just bringing in this is how we're destructuring and bringing in some of the state and then calling an action on it. So there are powerful event-based APIs with Pina that you can use to do a thing when state is mutated or an action is called. And this is just an example this is just a basic watcher example, but you also have this API on the store where you can subscribe to specific mutations. You could subscribe to specific actions when they're called, do something before or after, or even when an error occurs inside, so sort of creating an error boundary around that action if you wanted to. And then even the different types of mutations that go on in the store, you can subscribe to. So this is just really a place to start. This slide is just around a conceptual place to start. You say, okay, great. Like I'd like to start trying to use this on a personal project or maybe a small greenfield project that I'm going to start working on. Where would I start? How would I think about this? Use TAN-STAT query for your server state and caching, data mutations, loading states, and error handling. Use Pina for your UI state, user preferences, application settings, and any kind of complex workflows, like going back to that like multi-step form wizard kind of situation. Okay, so let's pull it all together. As I'm sure you might have, like some of you are wondering, like, okay, if I'm going to try to use this pattern, surely there are some ways that I might get into the weeds and cause myself some problems because I have two things that are manipulating and like working with state. Won't they step on each other's toes? Like, how do I make sure that you don't step on each other's toes, right? So why would you consider having an app that has both TAN-STAT query and Pina living inside of it? Well, if your app does have complex UI and state that is derived from server data that needs to be delivered to that complex UI, you're probably going to want both. We keep going back to the multi-step forms, but those are a great example of something like this, and it's probably something that's approachable for us because many of us have likely built these. But common pitfalls are going to be, the biggest one really is duplicate sources of truth. In my opinion, stale data, race conditions, memory leaks, those things can happen, but the duplicate source of truth, I think maintainability in an application is like the chief thing that we should all be striving for. And there are a lot of ways that we can influence how maintainable an app is, but maintaining a single source of truth inside your application for the data, I think, is a great way to do that. And since we have two mechanisms for working with that data now we have the opportunity to not have a single source of truth. So let TAN-STAT query the what and when. Let it handle the what and when of when data is fetched. And here's an example. So oftentimes the shape of the data that's coming from the server is not necessarily going to be exactly the right shape that we've defined or that we need in the front end. So maybe we have a method like this that is going to map it into the shape that we need. And then we have some options. So just to kind of like set the stage, we've got two flows generically, like we have two flows that we have to be concerned about. We have to be concerned about data is flowing from the server via TAN-STAT query. Now it's in client side in my app, and maybe I need it in Pina. And then we're certainly going to also have the situation where I've got stuff in Pina, stuff has changed, and now it needs to go back to the server. So how do we do that? So option one, on success. So this is an API that TAN-STAT query is exposing to you, where you can do things once successful query has occurred. You also have a cache subscriber, so when certain things happen in the cache, you could do a thing. And then this is just another way of interacting with that on success handler. And then finally, we have just a simple watch. Like it is a valid thing to just use a watcher, a normal view watcher in there as well. And this is that anti-pattern that I was talking about. It's an example. So you can see here we have a user store, right? But in the actions, we have a fetch users that is awaiting API.getUsers. That's the key, is line 12. That's the no-no, is I'm sidestepping TAN-STAT query now to go to my server and get the data. And now I have two mechanisms that are behaving differently that are interacting with my server. And I don't want to do that. That is, instead of that, it would be better, like I would prefer it to happen in a composable function instead of in the Pina store. But it would be better to be calling TAN-STAT query inside this action than just calling that repository that Axios called directly and sidestepping all of TAN-STAT query stuff that you're getting. Because now you're introducing inconsistent behavior into your app. Okay, so we figured out all of the, like, okay, data's flowing from the server, what's the no-no there, you know, that kind of thing. Now we've got, everything's loaded, stuff's changing, landscape's changing, and we may sometimes need stuff to sync back to the server. How do we do that? This is just basic run, you know, this is what your, that's what your imports would look like. This is what your store definition might look like. This is what the composable might look like that we talked about earlier. That's kind of like your repository for interacting with your server. And then we just have a basic watcher in here. So like when something happens, could be anything, but when something happens in the Pina store, we're using TAN-STAT query to make the server interaction. And then we can take action to sync that back to the Pina store. I had a watcher right there in the single file component, so I contradicted myself a little bit, but we have the same kind of example here. And this is just like, this is Will's opinion. Like, this is not like the only way to build an app, but you know, I'm just sharing my strong opinions on how I organize things. Like I contradicted myself in that I had it in the single file component. The way I would really do it is something like this. You can see this now doesn't care at all. Like all it cares about is the presentation of the data. It's not watching things and reacting to when things are happening and that kind of thing. That got moved up or moved over into the composable. So I generally will figure out a logical way to have my composables handling any of this like heavy lifting. I like to think about, our full stack apps. We think about them a lot of times as presentation or data at the core, back-end application, and then presentational, whatever that presentational may be. Might be server-side rendered, it might be an API and a totally decoupled front end, but we still think about it as part of the whole, right? Looking at the front end as a microcosm, I like to think about it a lot the same way. But instead of having a database, it's really like my server that's that thing. So I like to think about composable functions as being kind of like my application layer, and my single file components as being my presentation layer. I really want to work hard, or I really try to work hard to keep that presentation layer as free as I'm able of the heavy logic that I organize into the composition or the composable function layer. And I try to find a logical, like I presented this users repository kind of thing, but you don't necessarily have to organize your composable functions, obviously, one-to-one. Like you just want to find a consistent, logical way to organize them. So, best practices. Keep in TAN-stack query your raw server responses. Let it cache your API data. Let it handle your loading states and your error states, and handle your pagination, your infinite scroll, all that kind of stuff. Then let TAN-stack query use the event-based API in TAN-stack query to synchronize as needed, only as needed, to synchronize that data into Pina. User preferences, UI state, filter, sort, configuration, theme, auth object, all those kinds of things that are close to the UI. Sync those things into Pina and let them live there. Then, as needed, you have an event-based API also in Pina that can leverage TAN-stack query to sync back in the other direction. Best practices, this is just kind of wrapping up documentation. So a big part of organizing all of your stuff into, like, it may sound a little heavy-handed to have the lib folder with all the Axios calls in it, and then you're working really hard to organize all of your business logic, what would be considered your business logic, into the composables and that kind of thing. But being organized and having all of that kind of centralized in one spot will help you be able to document in a way, especially if you're using TypeScript, it will be a little bit self-documenting to a degree. Not to say that you don't have to write any documentation at all, but it goes a long way toward maintainability, which really is the ultimate goal. So take a Yagni approach. You ain't gonna need it to Pina at first. That's my encouragement to you. If you want to just get started on something with TAN-stack, I would encourage you, like, there's plenty of complex applications out there that can and are built without ever needing global state at all. That's not to say that global state is bad. Like, I've built plenty of apps and am working on plenty of apps that lean on global state heavily to achieve loose coupling of the data with the component trees. It's not that it's bad, but I do think that, one of the things that we're all here for is, hey, what's up and coming? Like, what patterns are we seeing emerge from our communities? And, like, what cool things are being developed? This is a pattern that I see that emerging from our community, is that I think we're going to see things go in the direction of Pina Colada, where, like, it's a TAN-stack situation, cache querying for your server response, and then global state when you need it. So as forward-thinking developers, I feel like these are patterns that we should try out in our own apps and validate, like, hey, are these good patterns or not? My opinion is yes, they are, which is why I'm teaching it to you today. But try it for yourself. And that's what I got for you guys today. Thank you for coming to my talk. Please connect with me on X, LinkedIn. It's my GitHub. the QR code is a connect on LinkedIn, but happy to take any questions if you guys have them. And if not, I think I can release you guys a little bit early. I've not used Ziggy. What is Ziggy?
We have something, we don't use Ziggy, but we have something that we developed called Luxian, which is it exports the Laravel named routes as JavaScript helpers. So I use proxy, and so I can just say what the route name is. I can provision it with an object that provides the parameters into a query string, and then knock off a get or a post or whatever. And then that delegates it to Axios and returns the Axios promise as a result, which we then process. So we're still pretty low level, but we're naming the routes. We never have any URLs inside of the application.
So in doing that, is that a mechanism for you guys to avoid having to like have intense documentation and that kind of thing, because your front-end teams can just like have an always up-to-date Axios library of... Okay.
It does make it very seamless. In the same way that in Laravel, when you use the route helper, you don't think about the URL, you just plug in the parameters that you know you need.
Gotcha.
It's just a direct IC.
Okay. And so what were you doing before, and how have you seen that benefit? Okay.
And then we have to go through the code and find all those places and change them.
Sure.
And that's hard because nothing's semantically named, right? It's all just URL strings.
Right.
And which can be very easily hidden under a few additions or compositions.
Gotcha.
Or helper functions.
So did you consider the repository approach when you guys were considering how to fix that problem? Because with a repository, you would only have one place, where that string concatenation was happening, and then you can it doesn't matter where it's being consumed around the front end. You would just if you were updating your Laravel routes, you would just go into the front end repository and fix that.
I'm not sure I get the difference, but we do use repository, so you definitely know what kind of repository.
Well, it was sounding like the solution that you were describing was you had a mechanism for taking your Laravel route definitions, turning them into Axios calls in your front end. Is that what you're doing?
Really is what it is. But we are effectively using a opinion kind of approach, as you were describing. Data stack is the first time I heard about it, but we're not looking at the caching at that level. This looks like it could be a benefit to us, but I'm not sure.
So you guys are doing some caching of parts of your Pina stores and that sort of thing? Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions? I'm sorry, were you okay. Cool. Thank you guys.